And finally, in our last installment of the effects of global warming, um, we're talk a little bit about biodiversity for now. And so, obviously, warmer temperatures will affect the distribution of species. And so, depending on the species, if they're more generalists and they're able to adapt very fast, then it's likely that their range of where you can find species will actually expand. So, not only will they be at the places where they normally are, but they'll actually, if in the northern hemisphere, they will expand more north because the warmer temperatures are at higher latitudes. On the other hand, if they're unable to adapt fast enough, they'll either have to shift north because it's too warm where they are, or they will go extinct. And so, it all depends on how vulnerable the species is. Um, and the species with a more specialized niche, so a more specialized role in their ecosystem, and any species with a narrow tolerance is going to be the most threatened by global warming. And so, some examples are coral reefs. They live at very shallow depths. Um, they need light for photosynthesis with their symbiotic algae on their inside of their bodies, and that if they don't have these algae called zooxanthellae, then they'll actually expel them, which is where we get coral bleaching from, and ultimately the coral will die. Polar seas are also like very, very specialized, so as things get warmer, um, these organisms actually don't really have anywhere to go. Wetlands are very important ecosystems, which we'll talk about more, and then of course tundras. And so when you have species that are very, very specialized, they're not going to be able to adapt as fast, and therefore you're going to get extinctions. Another thing that can have an effect on biodiversity is, sorry about that, is an increase in forest fires. And so when forest fires increase due to extreme drought, these forest fires will actually release more carbon dioxide, and we have yet again another positive feedback loop. Here we're going into the effects on agriculture. Agriculture obviously is an anthropogenic system, and so farming depends on a stable climate. And so global climate shifts end up speeding up the water cycle. And so when you don't have a stable water cycle or a hydrological cycle, then your farming gets pretty seriously affected. If you get too much rain, you could get root rot. If you get too little rain, then you can have extreme drought. So it can have a very large effect. We do tend to have an increase in agricultural productivity, like I said before. Warmer temperatures, increased precipitation, higher levels of carbon dioxide. Those are all going to speed up primary productivity. And of course, agriculture is our plants. Again, sorry about my updates coming in. Um, and then, on the other hand, we can have a decrease in agricultural productivity. Soils tend to be less fertile in the north, and climate shifts are forcing crop production higher in the northern latitudes because it's too warm where we were originally growing certain crops. Um, and then, of course, areas that are fed by snow melt, if there's no snow, then it won't melt, and therefore we'll have lower amounts of water available. Another effect that that affects us as humans is our fish stock, and so a lot of these aquaculture ponds are actually really close to river deltas and to other water sources, and so sea level rise will actually flood these aquaculture ponds, and so it could be really detrimental depending on what kind of fish are being grown here. Um, so that can be have an effect on our fish stock in these aquaculture areas. Also, just effects on us directly is that we're going to have increased deaths from heat. It's happened in very recent years, just this past summer. You have a lot of deaths coming from vulnerable populations from heat waves. And so a lot of the elderly, people in poor health, urban poor, not to mention also you have deaths from flooding. So you end up with a reduction in electricity or electricity being turned off due to flooding. And so these vulnerable populations are going to have lives at risk. Um, excuse me. Um, and so we're also going to have an increase in infectious disease. And so anywhere where you have an ability for standing water, you're going to end up having more mosquitoes. And so mosquitoes can carry all kinds of stuff, right? Dengue fever, yellow fever, malaria, most recently Zika, um, West Nile virus. And so if we have increasing flooding, then we're going to have more mosquitoes. Not only that, the warmer temperatures itself will allow mosquitoes to spread their range. So the mosquitoes that were carrying Zika were really only in the Caribbean. Now we actually found some up in Florida in their range. So their range is actually increasing, which could increase our risk to infectious disease. Um, we also have an increase of carbon dioxide, and so increased carbon dioxide means increased photosynthesis. So that means we have more of these plants that will affect us in bad ways. So poison ivy here in the Northeast is a really big problem, and we're going to have more of it with increased carbon dioxide. Also, we'll end up with increase in insects that affects tree growth. So, these insects that are actually affecting trees and their tree productivity is going to affect us because obviously we rely on wood for lumber, paper, all those kinds of things. And finally, you end up with flood and drought. Like I've said before, you have this migration of what we call environmental refugees or climate change refugees because people are forced to move because the areas that they're in are no longer habitable. So, global warming does have direct effects on people, not even mentioning all the indirect effects that we had talked about previous. And so, obviously, the way to talk about this, and I'm sorry that this graphic is in the way, so I'll just fix that while we're talking about it. The reducing greenhouse emissions is a way to reduce global warming. And so we obviously need international cooperation because it's a global issue. You guys did some presentations and we talked about the Paris Climate Accords. The other treaty that was signed in 2005 is called the Kyoto Protocol. And so you end up with 187 countries agreeing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so if you look here, we have China and India and the United States being at the top of greenhouse gas emissions. So right here, up here, you guys can see that. And unfortunately, the United States was not one of the countries to join in on this Kyoto Protocol. And in more recent years, obviously, we know that we have also pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so even though all of these countries have agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide levels have actually increased a lot faster than expected in 2005. So that's why we started looking at the Paris Climate Agreement, because we wanted to, increase our effects in reducing the emissions, because it's a global issue. It really is going to take the whole world coming together to help us reduce this. And finally, putting a price on carbon dioxide is a way to also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the way that we can do this is by putting in place something called a carbon tax. So for each unit of a greenhouse gas that we emit, so either carbon dioxide or methane, both carbon